On the Eastern Front, German soldiers learned to fear a sound. Not the roar of an engine, but its absence. A soft rush of wind, like fabric passing overhead in the dark. And then the blast of a bomb. By the time they looked up, the aircraft was already gliding away. And when they finally shot one down and reached the wreck, they found something they had not expected. The pilot was a woman, barely into her 20s. The Germans, the story goes, began calling them the Nachthexen, the night witches. Over 3 years, these women flew some of the most dangerous missions of the entire war, night after night, in an aircraft that had no business being over a battlefield at all. This is their story, told as carefully as the record allows. The Night Witches were the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Force. They existed because of one woman, Marina Raskova, a famous Soviet aviator sometimes called the Soviet Amelia Earhart, who used her fame and her personal access to Stalin to win permission to form female combat units. In October 1941, with the country reeling from the German invasion, an order authorized 3 all-female air regiments. Women were already volunteering in their thousands, desperate to fight for a country in danger of collapse. They trained at the Engels Flying School on the Volga, and they trained fast. A navigator's course that had taken 3 years before the war was compressed into a matter of months. The 508th was the regiment that would stay entirely female, from the pilots and navigators to the mechanics and the armorers, right through to the end of the war. Most of them were young, many between 17 and 26 years old. And then there was the machine they were handed. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a biplane designed back in the 1920s as a basic trainer and crop duster. It was built of plywood and canvas. It had an open cockpit that left the 2-person crew exposed to the freezing night air. Fully loaded, it struggled to reach around 60 miles an hour, slower than some cars. It carried a pilot and a navigator and only a small load of bombs slung under the wings. There was little in the way of instruments. The navigator found the target with a map, a stopwatch, a torch, and the naked eye. On paper, it was close to the worst possible aircraft you could send into a modern war. It was slow, it was fragile, and it was flammable. A single burst of tracer fire could turn all that plywood and canvas into a torch in seconds. But its weaknesses hid a strange advantage. The Po-2 was so slow that the fast German fighters sent to hunt it had the opposite problem. They could stall simply trying to fly slowly enough to line up a shot. It flew low, close to the ground, beneath the effective reach of the radar and the heavier defenses of the era. And because it was so light and so simple, a pilot could throttle the engine right back and glide. That is the heart of the whole story. These women took an obsolete trainer and turned each of its flaws into a method. What they could not do with speed or armor or firepower, they did with patience, darkness, and silence. Their tactic was as nerve-wracking as it sounds. They would approach a target in the dark, and then, close in, cut the engine right back and glide toward it almost without sound. The only warning the defenders got was that soft rush of wind over the wings. They would release their bombs, restart the engine, and slip away into the night before the searchlights and the flak could find them. According to the tradition, it was exactly that sound, said to be like a broomstick sweeping through the air, that earned them the witch's name from the German troops below. It is a vivid story, and it is worth saying plainly that historians are not certain exactly how or when the nickname really arose. One popular version even gets flagged as doubtful. But the tactic behind it, the silent glide out of the dark, is very well documented. And this was not a handful of daring raids. It was relentless, industrial, night after night. On a single night, a crew might fly somewhere between 8 and 18 separate missions, each one lasting perhaps 30 to 50 minutes. Fly to the target, glide, release, restart, fly home, land in the dark. While the mechanics, also women, reloaded the bombs by hand, the crew waited and then took off and did it again. Again. Again, until the sky began to lighten. They flew in the open, in the cold, over-defended ground, and they did it for years, not weeks. Veterans later recalled the exhaustion as its own enemy, the way the freezing wind numbed your hands on the controls, the way you learned to sleep in snatched minutes between flights. The danger is easy to picture. The sheer grind behind it is harder, and it is the part that most defined their war. Over the course of the war, this regiment flew an astonishing number of missions. You will often see the figure of 30,000 sorties attached to the Night Witches. It is worth being careful here, because precision is the whole point of a channel like this. That larger number usually refers to all three Soviet women's air regiments combined. For the 588th itself, the well-supported figure is roughly 23,000 combat sorties, with some detailed accounts putting it near 23,600, dropping on the order of 3,000 tons of bombs. One pilot, Irina Sebrova, is credited with more than 1,000 sorties on her own. More than 20 of these women were eventually named Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor. However you count it, and the counts do vary, it is a staggering record for a single regiment in obsolete trainers, and it came at a real price. Around 30 of the women were killed in action over the course of the war. Remember that in the early days they flew without parachutes at all. The reasoning was grim and simple. A parachute was weight, and weight left behind was another bomb carried. So they went up over defended targets with no way out of a burning aircraft. Only from 1944 did they routinely carry parachutes. The danger was not abstract. On one night, from the 31st of July into the 1st of August 1943, a single German night fighter caught the regiment in the dark and shot down 4 of its aircraft in quick succession. It was one of the worst nights of the war for them. And in August 1944, over Poland, the pilot Tatiana Makarova and her navigator Vera Belik were hit and killed when their canvas biplane caught fire and went down. Both were later named Heroes of the Soviet Union. It is also worth being honest about the world these women served. Their courage was entirely their own, but it was spent in the service of a repressive state, one that treated capture as something close to disgrace. Their bravery belongs to them. The regime that used it does not deserve to be romanticized. It helps to put one name to all of this. Nadezhda Popova flew, by the most commonly cited count, around 850 combat missions. On one single night, she is said to have flown 18 of them. She was shot down and forced down more than once, and each time she went back up. She survived the war, married a fellow pilot she had met during it, and lived into her 90s, long enough to be honored many times over and to tell the story herself. She was one of many, not a lone heroine, and she would have been the first to say so. But her record gives a human scale to what these women actually did, over and over, in the freezing dark, for years on end, when each single flight was a coin toss, and each one had to be followed by the next. The regiment was led throughout the war by Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who guided it from its very first missions to the last. She remains, by most accounts, the only woman ever awarded the Soviet Order of Suvorov, a decoration meant for commanders who handled their forces skillfully under severe pressure. Marina Raskova, the aviator who had created the regiments in the first place, did not live to see the victory. She was killed in a crash in early 1943, and here is a small correction that even serious accounts sometimes get wrong. When she died, Raskova was flying with a different regiment, the 507th, not with the Night Witches themselves. She was given the first state funeral of the war, and her ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall. The regiment did not stay the 508th for long. In early 1943, it earned the honored title of a Guards unit and was renamed the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. That autumn it took the battle name Taman, for its part in the brutal fighting on the Taman Peninsula. From there its women flew on through the Caucasus, the Crimea, Belarus and Poland, and were still flying combat over German soil and near Berlin in the final months of the war in 1945. In October of that year, the war won, the regiment was quietly disbanded and its women sent home. And then, as so often happens, much of the world simply moved on. In the West especially, the story of the women who bombed in the dark faded into a footnote, if it was remembered at all. The Night Witches are not a story about the glory of war. They are a story about young women handed a hopeless machine and an impossible job, who answered it with skill, endurance and sheer nerve, and who paid for it in the dark over 3 long years. It is the war seen from an open cockpit at 2 in the morning, freezing, with no parachute, on your 14th flight of the night, listening for the fighter you cannot see. Most of them were barely out of school. They were not looking for glory, and the state they served did not always give them much of it. What they left behind is simpler and harder than a legend. A record of ordinary young people doing something almost unimaginable and doing it again the next night. That is the front that usually gets forgotten. And that is exactly why it is worth telling.